Victoria and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the worst books of 2020 or the most disappointing books of 2020. In my most recent video I tier ranked all of the books that I read in 2020, so if you watched that you know which ones were at the bottom of the list. The ones that I'm going to be talking about today are the ones that got 1 or 2 stars. So the way I kind of rank is 1 star is hated it or disliked it strongly, and then 2 stars is more I thought it was okay or there are some redeeming qualities but I still didn't really like it that much, or it was just okay. Let's just jump into it. I don't exactly know what order this is. I'm just going to be talking about the books I didn't like. I'll start with the book I didn't like the most. It is Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. I read this in December. I talked about it in my December wrap-up. I just knew that Gillian Flynn wrote Gone Girl. I read the book a few years ago, watched the movie, overall enjoyed it. I know it's a dark thriller and it's a little bit creepy and weird, but I still felt like it was good because the twist was interesting. And I don't know why Sharp Objects was necessarily on my list. You know, it's just one of those like, oh, it's a popular author. And I know that a few people on BookTube like this book. But boy, was it not for me. It has to do with a girl who is a journalist and is a cutter and has to go back to her small hometown and write about young girls that are getting murdered, and she's faced with dealing with her past and all of this stuff that bubbles up to the surface and her weird relationship with her mother and other people in town. And overall, I just did not like the story plot. I thought a lot of it was just not believable to me, and also just no. I guessed who the bad people were too. In the end, it just seems so obvious of who could actually be doing the evil because there's really only 1 or 2 main evil people, and it's kind of clear that they are. So anyways, I guess the ending, I didn't like it. Not for me. 1 star. Terrible book. The next 1-star book is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. I only gave 2 books 1 star this year, so these are the 2. This, I also wasn't entirely sure why I listened to this. I have heard about Neil Gaiman before, and I think this is one of his popular books. Randomly decided to choose it from Libby. I knew 0 about this book, so I went into it totally blind. Turns out that it's like a really dark adult fantasy, which is super strange, and it's about this man who goes back to his childhood home and childhood town for like a funeral and then starts to remember all the things that happened to him as a kid. He was friends with a young witch, technically, who has magical powers, and he encountered an evil spirit that came from another world, and it was so weird and so strange and way too creepy for me. I will give props to Neil Gaiman's writing. I think is very poetic, but the story itself was just not for me. It was absolutely terrible and not for me. And I should have known this because Neil Gaiman also wrote Coraline, and then the movie was based off the book. I watched the movie a few years ago with some friends and I absolutely hated it because it was just the creepiest thing ever. So I should have known better, but I didn't. I didn't correlate those two. And I think it's safe to say that I won't be reading any Neil Gaiman. And again, nothing against him or people who like him. It's just not for me. It's way too creepy, weird, fantasy, darkness, demonic power stuff that was just strange. Not for me, as I now say for the 10th time. With those 2 books, I kind of went in blind. I wasn't necessarily expecting them to be great. I just didn't even know what was gonna happen, and then it happened and whatever. I didn't like them. With the next book, Illuminae by Amy Kaufman, I went into it with high expectations, primarily because this is incredibly hyped. This is all over BookTube, and it's mixed media, sci-fi, young adult sci-fi that's really hyped, and everyone loves this book. I really did not like it at all. I gave it 2 stars though, so there is some redeeming qualities because I think the premise of the way it's written, with it being mixed media and you're reading as if you're reading like text messages and emails and there's, you know, artwork and stuff, it's interesting to a certain degree. I just had a main issue with the story itself and the characters. I don't read that much sci-fi, so I don't know if I should really have a super strong opinion about it, but I just know that like the whole spaceship and the world, it's the future, traveling through space, and there's an evil battleship that wants to explode our space station and our planet. That kind of thing I'm not really into, so I guess I should have known that. My main issue with this book was the characters and the dialogue, particularly the dialogue with it being crude teenage sexual innuendo humor. And I don't have necessarily, well, I don't really like that, but I also don't necessarily have an issue with it if it's just one character and like that's the way that one character speaks. But the author decided to let all of the characters talk that way, and not just the teenagers and like the young adults, but also all of the adults in the story and other supporting characters that came into the story all talk that way and just had this stupid, stuck-up, snooty, crude humor. It didn't make sense to me, and I really didn't like it. I didn't care about the characters. I thought it was cringy, cheesy, bad, just bad, poorly written storyline. The seed of the idea was interesting, which is why I gave it 2-star, but it just wasn't executed properly for me, and I definitely won't be continuing the rest of the series. So yeah, really didn't like that one. And I had high hopes because it was so hyped, and I read Side before then, and I really enjoyed that kind of dystopian young adult world. So I think that's what I was expecting with this, but didn't work for me. Alright, so moving on to the next disappointment. It was Wildwood by Colin Malloy. I originally saw this book on my friend's shelf, and I thought that it was a beautiful book. I didn't know much going into it except that it is a middle grade children's fantasy. I know that it was set in Portland, and I knew that two of my friends really liked this book. So I kind of also went into it just open-minded and probably with slightly higher expectations. I was so bored. I just didn't want to continue reading it, but I, at this point, have never DNF'd a book or not finished a book. So I continued on, and there are some redeeming qualities to why I gave it 2 stars, and I thought it was just okay. But overall, I was bored, and I also didn't like how much it tried to be like a Narnia retelling. I had an evil witch that was in this magical world that had taken over the land that everyone thought was dead or wasn't alive, but turns out she is, and she has this army of coyotes in this book who are on her side and trying to kill the other side in the forest, and she steals a human child because she needs it for sacrifice. I'm like, it's literally Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's the same story, but it's just more poorly done. And so I didn't like that kind of aspect of it. But I definitely did appreciate some things about it, and I think the ode to Portland and the city was fun and quirky, and there's some cute stuff in there to that extent. But overall, a disappointment. Up next, I have The Orphans Tale by Pam Jenoff. I also read this in December, and it was in my December wrap-up. I had read a Pam Jenoff book earlier in the year and gave it 3 stars. I thought it was a mediocre World War II story called The Lost Girls of Paris. And so I had heard about the author, and this I was borrowing from my sister-in-law because it was on her bookshelf, and you know, it's a World War II historical fiction. Totally up my alley. Love that genre. So I kind of went into it open-minded too, but then realized that, oh, maybe I shouldn't expect that much because no one's talking about this book. Sorry about these barking dogs. Maybe they'll stop, but if not, I'm just gonna power through. So The Orphans Tale I thought was an even more mediocre World War II story. I didn't really care about the characters. The plotline was so muddy. There's 2 main female characters. One is a teenage girl who had to give up her child and then ends up running away and then finding a train car full of babies, Jewish babies, and decides to steal one to replace the child that she had to give away, and runs into the woods with this child. And then this German circus finds her in the woods and decides to take her in. And then there's another lady who's like in her 30s who was married to a Nazi, and he decided to leave her, and so she rejoins this German circus undercover because she's a Jew. And these two, this teenage girl and this older lady, become friends, and it's the story of their friendship, but they also like don't like each other half the time. They're learning to be trapeze artists, and you know, there's like an evil Nazi guy who's trying to get the Jews that are hiding, and it was just not good. Weird circumstances. Like I just didn't like it. So yeah, that's that one. And then the next mediocre thriller for me was The Nanny by Gilly McMillan or Jilly McMillan, not sure. This was a thriller that I read towards the beginning of 2020, and I think I initially gave it 3 stars because I didn't read any other thrillers before. Well, I read thrillers in previous years, but hadn't read a thriller in a while. But then as I really picked up reading in 2020 and started reading more thrillers and more different kinds of books, I realized where my rating scale falls, and I was really afraid to rate books harshly. But going back, this was not a good thriller, and it had some things, so I gave it a 2-star, but overall wasn't great, not in comparison to some other thrillers that I read. This is a multiple timeline, multiple perspective story, primarily about a girl who was raised by a nanny, and then the nanny mysteriously disappears when she was a child. And she has kind of an estranged relationship with her parents and really only cared about this nanny. And then several years later, when this girl now is an adult, her childhood nanny comes back. And the story kind of unfolds and you're trying to figure out, is this the same nanny? Is this some woman who's pretending to be this other woman? Or how are the parents involved and what's going on there? What actually happened back then when that girl was a child? There's some things that are interesting, and I think that there's some things that are redeeming, like the multiple perspective, and you're kind of trying to figure out what happens, but it was really easy to figure out what happened. It didn't really shock me. I was like, oh yeah, well that makes sense. So 2 stars. I think it's just an okay thriller. And then I have 3 more books. And these last 3 books were all very hyped and probably a lot of people's favorites, but they just didn't work for me. One I'll talk about, Normal People, has mixed reviews, so I'll talk about that one first because some people absolutely love it and it's their favorite and other people hate it and think it's trash. Normal People by Sally Rooney. I also read this in December, talked about it then. I was very conflicted with this book. I think I both loved and hated it. I loved how it was written because it sucked me in and I read it in one sitting, but I hated the story and I didn't like what the characters were doing and how they lived their lives and how the book ended and just the whole love story, on again, off again relationship, miscommunication, they're not talking to each other. I just don't like that. I found it annoying, and I think even though it seemed realistic, it seemed like this happens in real life and this is how relationships work, some relationships work these days, I just didn't like it. I didn't like reading about it. It frustrated me. It made me sad that people live like that. But at the same time, it still captivated me. I still kept reading. It's sort of like watching, a train wreck or a car wreck. You don't like what happened, but you can't look away. So that was the experience for me when I was reading it. And that's why I ended up giving it 2 stars, because I wouldn't recommend people to read this. I don't think it's worth reading. But there's definitely some things the author did that made me want to keep reading it. So that's my thoughts on Normal People. And then the last 2 are very controversial because they're everyone's favorites. The first one is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I just didn't really care about Evelyn Hugo and her love story and her, 7 husbands. And I didn't necessarily like where the story went. I think there are a few redeeming qualities of it with the multiple timelines, and it's this older Evelyn Hugo who's kind of in her final days reliving her life and retelling her story to a journalist who's going to write a book about her life. The premise of that is interesting, but I just found myself just not caring. I was not interested and was kind of like, whatever. So that's why I gave it 2 stars. I thought it was just okay. And then finally, Cersei by Madeline Miller. Also very hyped. Everyone wants to read it and has read it and loves it. And I thought it was just okay. Again, some redeeming qualities. I think the premise of it is interesting, but I think I just don't care about mythology and the Greek gods or the Roman gods, and I was bored with this book as well. I wanted it to end. It didn't grip me or suck me in, and I didn't want to keep reading. I kind of was just waiting for the book to end. It seemed like it kept dragging on, and I think primarily it's because this story is meant to cover this god, Cersei, her entire lifetime, which is thousands and thousands of years because she's immortal and doesn't die. So it's her origin story and what happened to her. And it's such an epic story and written over thousands of years, but I just found myself being like, so what? Why did I read that? What did I get out of it? And just thought it was okay. Didn't really love it at all like everyone else does, and nothing against anyone. It just didn't work for me. Those are all the disappointing books that I read in 2020, all the 1 and 2 stars. I think I'm still trying to figure out where my taste lies. I'm very open-minded to reading pretty much anything. I also need to figure out which hyped books are actually worth reading. Because deep down, I think I probably knew that Cersei and the 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo weren't my kind of books. But they're just so hyped that I had to read them too. And some of my favorite people on BookTube talk about them. I knew that they weren't really for me, so I probably didn't need to read them, but I just kind of couldn't help myself. So I need to figure that out this year. And in general, I just really want to mostly read books that I love, like 4 and 5 star books. I know that's hard, but that's what I want to aim to do. So I'm going to try to read less books just to read them, and definitely read more books that are not only very highly rated, but also sound interesting to me from the get-go. So yeah, that's the hope for 2021. We'll see. Thank you so much for watching this video, and let me know what your most disappointing books were so that I don't read them accidentally. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in another one. Bye!